Welcome to Saur Energy. This is Manish Kumar, and you are watching Conversations with Saur Energy. In our latest episode, we are joined by Mr. Mahesh Ramanujam, who is the President and CEO for Global Network for Zero. So, Mr. Mahesh, thanks a lot for talking to Saur Energy International. So, first question, if any person who is not aware or not exposed to the idea of green buildings and net zero buildings, so how you can explain to a person who has no idea about green buildings and net zero buildings?
So, green building is a building that is actually taking into consideration all sustainability aspects, which means that starting from site selection, how you use your energy, how you give comfort to your occupants, how you really use your materials in a more environmentally friendly way, how do you really reduce your consumption of materials itself so that you can reduce cost and the environmental footprint, and most importantly, focusing on the most important asset of the building, the people itself, by focusing on indoor air quality, their comfort, their productivity, and all of these things are included inside the green building. Now, when it comes to net zero building, particularly, generally we focus on energy, water, waste, and of course the emissions. There the focus remains on really trying to have a building not be harmful in sense that the net greenhouse gas emission is reduced. So you want the building to produce more energy than it consumes. Preferably it consumes renewable energy so that it is not actually consuming energy from fossil fuels and increasing the carbon footprint of the building. Then if it is a net zero water, you want to use less water than you are able to store and harvest and use. And then if it is waste, you really want to make sure that you don't send a lot of waste to the landfill. You basically send no waste to the landfill, and every waste is usable. And then last but not the least, the energy part is about really making sure that you are able to give energy back to the grid than taking more energy from the grid. So fundamentally, a green building is a building that is holistic in considering the entire environmental aspect. Net zero building is focused on making sure the building itself is really not doing any harm back to the environment specific to greenhouse gas emissions and the causes and effects with it.
I think the concept of green buildings and net zero buildings have started creating ripples in the last 1 decade or last 5 years. And now popularly we are seeing a lot of media reports, a lot of publicity items from the companies who are adopting these net zero buildings and green buildings. So how you see the pace of India when it comes to their adoption, their movement towards green buildings or net zero buildings?
So the most important thing, I think you rightly pointed out, we are building pace, right? India cannot afford to not have green buildings. India cannot afford to have net zero buildings because most of the buildings that we have to build are yet to be built. So luckily we got on a strong foundation. The first green building you can officially declare in 2008. The CII IGBC lead rated building was the first building. And that was at that time the most magnanimous building. Now today, sitting in Delhi, sitting in Gurgaon, just as an example, when you come through the Delhi airport, it's a triple platinum certified airport.
Yes.
And it is benchmarking against all airports in the world, probably better than other airports in the world. Then you look at the entire corridor of Gurgaon, you will see green buildings after green buildings after green buildings. So the adoption is visible, right? So last 30 years, the green building movement has done a good job of really driving that incremental adoption, which started with energy efficiency, resource optimization, mostly related to HVAC, comfort and all. But now it has become a trend. It has become a best practice. And it has also become the foundation on which people try to evaluate a good building versus a bad building or a status quo building. So I think the progress we are seeing in India is at par and in line with the adoption that we are seeing in the world. So India is rated as number 3rd in the green buildings in the world. That's not a small achievement, and you are right, it was achieved in the last decade and a half.
Yeah.
Now, what I am excited about is when you come to net zero buildings, we are leading from the front. We have more net zero buildings than any other comparable places in the world, right?
Okay.
So the good news is people are accepting it, adopting it, and I always say that sustainability is in our roots. And we are sustainable not because it's a fancy concept for us, but it is survival for us, right? We have the foundation. We didn't have enough resources 30 years ago. Still, 70% of our population in this country doesn't have the resources, luckily, that you and I enjoy. Yeah. So from that perspective, sustainability starts with frugality. We have always been trained by our ancestors to use what you can use and don't use what you should not use. So we are less consumers. Unfortunately, we have become a little bit bad on the consumption side, but I think we can get that back under control. So long story short, it's our core DNA. Now we are identifying and doing it in the modern building design, construction, and operations.
So because you talked about Gurgaon, so as we were coming towards Gurgaon, we see a large number of buildings are now adopting glasses in their building construction. So do you think this is only to increase that daylight infusion so that their energy efficiency go up, their dependency towards power go down, or anything if done wrongly in these glass buildings could also be a kind of problem?
Yeah, I think, it's a classic debate, right? So we have all lived in, if you take our past, very past of our ancestors, where you lived your ancestral home or your original home, you had more space, you got free air, you really didn't have to use phone, the fan and the ACs and everything else, because you couldn't afford it. So, and now you didn't have the power to run them. So then we moved into this modern world where we started getting into these spaces that are not well lit, that are not well aerated, and it created all kinds of problems and challenges for us. Fundamentally, we are humans. As humans, we are supposed to be out there in the open. We are designed to be out there in the open. So if you don't have access to daylight, it has got a direct implications on you related to productivity, cognitive ability, and most importantly, your longevity. So you must have daylight, you must have sunlight, and vitamin D is such an important ingredient that we all need to have. In fact, Indians need more than the rest of the world because we have a natural deficiency towards it. Now, having said that, the modern building uses a lot of glass. There has always been a criticism with the use of glass because people felt like the glass is not that sustainable. It's a myth, it's not a fact. There are thousands of buildings around the world that have been using glass, that has helped them to develop faster, quicker, and cheaper, and most importantly, bring buildings the most important ingredient called daylight, and eventually it translates into productivity and well-being of the people inside. Now, in Gurgaon, or for that matter in any place in the world where temperatures go in extremes, right? Sitting in Delhi, 50 is a number that we are getting used to now, which I don't like personally. You all live in Delhi. We easily hit that 50 degrees Celsius or 48 degrees Celsius, or at least feels like 50 degree type of mode. At that time, you see extensive heat come into these glass, which are transparent mechanisms that puts a load back on the occupants, either related to glare, or the heat itself comes in, or for that matter, other challenges like, cleanliness, dust, because we are in a very dust-oriented environment as well. So all these things makes the glass building a little bit challenging. And I think better passive design techniques, more innovation, more understanding about how you really orient the building so that the sunlight impact itself is mitigated, can be achieved through better design so that the glass itself becomes effective. So I think what could go wrong is that if you did a glass building with a bad design, a lot of things could go wrong and it could drive up the energy efficiency needs of the building and the demand of the building. However, there are thousands of examples around the world that has been tackled. So it always starts with good, active, passive design. Here the word active, I'm just throwing this in to just say that you have to think very intentionally that you have to adopt a passive design technique that allows for a very clear control on thermal comfort and thermal insulation. Second, it really allows for productivity, ventilation, and most importantly, daylight. So those are the ingredients that I would say to balance. That should be the key goal, and then the building should be designed to take care of it, and the material itself will be an enabler rather than being an impediment.
So one basic science that I want to understand from you, because we have all heard about greenhouse gas emission and greenhouse effect. So what happens that although if you're using glass building if you're using glass in a building, so that will definitely facilitate the entry of light, but at the same time heat will also enter and likely to increase the power demand. So what kind of design, what we need to take care in designing so that the temperature do not go up, or we do corrective measures accordingly?
I think there are basic techniques that many people use, which is to really, first of all, daylight is important. Second is that whenever the daylight is actually interfering with either the energy demand, then shading techniques have been deployed. So automatic shading screens come up and down. That becomes a requirement. Okay. Because if you don't do that, then obviously it is going to cause the energy demand for the building to go up. And most importantly, working conditions within the building, like bright sunlight, like Gurgaon in this example, will be very, very challenging. And third is that actually a good thermal insulation inside the building is one of the important things that passive designers focus on, so that will assure that even with that kind of penetration, you can balance the energy load that comes with the building. And most importantly, I think we all need to think about renewable energy. Renewable energy integration is important. As much as we focus on energy efficiency, we must also focus on switching energy sources from fossil fuel to renewable energy. And that is where the renewable energy comes handy. So even if the energy demand goes up, but it comes from this most infinite supply of source called sun or the wind, whatever that is, and depending upon the choice you make. And then it allows you to really balance that moment. So I think to sum it back up, I'll make the point that I made earlier, which is that good design will ensure that such glass-centric buildings don't drive up the demand for energy. And of course, a good energy design will ensure that you are not pulling the wrong set of energy so that you increase your greenhouse gas emissions. So use more renewable energy to produce and do better design to reduce.
Because you just picked up the issue of use of renewable energy. So we have seen the Akshay Urja Bhavan of the MNRE. We have also seen the Focus Energy building in Gurgaon that in their buildings they have used vertical solar, a large amount of solar modules used vertically. So how you see the adoption of BIPV in these buildings, and what are the major challenges when it comes to use of BIPV in these buildings? A lot of data centers are also coming up with this vertical solar.
See, the BIPV is a fantastic trend. It has been in works for almost a decade and a half. Many people have tried it. And the fact that when we talked about glass, the glass itself could be a solar type of interface it could have. So I do know some products where the glass itself will become photovoltaic and is capable of generating energy so that it'll give you the comfort inside, it'll avoid the glare inside, it'll bring more daylight inside, but however it'll be energy producing so that you can tackle that. That innovation is already there in the marketplace. But however, this is still in the innovation stage, this is still in the early adoption stage, and it creates a lot of challenges. The primary challenge that everybody quotes is that it doesn't give the same amount of energy it doesn't produce the same amount of energy in terms of performance efficiency when you compare it to the
rooftop
ground mount, rooftop and whatnot. And that is that is a very valid observation. Second is that the aesthetic of a building, right? Yeah. Always, when you build a building of that, in case of the Urja Bhavan, you want that building to be your legacy. You want that you're building that building to be, or your home. You want that to be so special. You want that to stand apart. So when you do that, what happens is that you have to really take into consideration the aesthetic aspect of it. That is the second. So you don't want it to look ugly with all the solar panels on top and side and whatnot. So you really want it to be integrated with the design of the building. So that is always a little bit of a personal preference, a consumer preference, an architectural preference. So you have to really think through that. But the benefits outweigh all these challenges. First and foremost, when you do vertical integration, the first thing you're tackling is the space needs. Because today in this country, solar adoption, the biggest challenge will be land. Okay. Because the land is expensive in this country. So wherever you go, first either land is expensive or you have to get clearances or you need to find a substation near it. So many other attributes makes it difficult. Then for a building, we prefer that the building has the solar on-site rather than off-site, because it is always better the building can be independent of the grid, or at least should be ready to be independent of the grid. So definitely reducing land. Then of course cleaning is much easier because you're not tilted. Third is that the outcome and efficiency questions can be normalized over a period of time. I think the efficiency can be attained. And then also I think that you also can deal with microclimatic conditions, right? Because shading of the building, because when you do traditional solar, shading becomes a big challenging factor. So with the BIPV, you have opportunities to really explore passive design strategies that will help you to orient the building and also be able to bring the solar panels that will avoid the shading requirements from your adjacent building or from your adjacent tall tower, etc. So there is a lot of potential for it, but we need more adopters. And I think the barriers to entry is more the stigma that we have with related to aesthetics, output, and even giving it a fair chance for people to try it. So this is in the journey, but I do think examples like what you quoted will be a game changer. And I think at some point in time we'll be forced to do it.
Okay, so talking about the existing net zero buildings in India, like there is a mosque in Kundapur in Udupi district, where there is a mosque that is a net zero building that is certified by the Green Council of India, Green Building Council of India. There is Akshay Urja Bhavan. There are a lot of other buildings also by several corporate houses coming up. So, from your experience, what is the best building that you have seen in India that is like net zero and shows, portrays the best case study for you?
I think the example that I will quote personally is the Sri Ramakrishna Exports building, two diamond crafting facilities
Which city?
in Surat.
Okay.
And it is a LEED gold building that was again certified to LEED platinum. It scores number 96 as one of the top 2 buildings in the top 6 buildings in the world. It's LEED certified, it's LEED platinum certified, recertified many times. The interesting part about that building is that that building was able to accelerate its net zero target that was committed on 2030 to 2024. In fact, we certified that very recently. So obviously, I have a deeper insight into that building. Why? Why am I talking about that building? Because that building actually tackles net zero in the right way, which is to focus on scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. These 3 emissions must be tackled together, then it becomes net zero. Obviously, the definition of net zero is nebulous for all the right reasons. Some people only consider scope 1 and 2. They are postponing scope 3 for the future. But we think it is very important to really hold that narrative and hold that standard and definition very specifically on scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 should be mitigated to truly call yourselves net zero. Now, how you mitigate it, that could be a different discussion, but you cannot dilute that definition. So from that perspective, I believe the building in Surat, the Sri Ramakrishna Exports, 2 diamond crafting facilities, is a true benchmark for what a net zero building should be.
So in India, we have the Green Building Council of India, which also started net zero building certification. There is guideline from the GRIHA also, and then there is in US there is a LEED guideline, LEED certification. So how all these things differ, and you also are, your organization is also certifying net zero buildings and green buildings. So how all these 4 differ from each other?
So first and foremost, the work that has been done by IGBC, GRIHA, and for that matter LEED is remarkable. The work that has been done by Green Building Movement is fabulous, right? Why? Because nothing existed before 30 years ago, even 15 years ago, even 10 years ago. So when you look at the national building guidelines of this country, that didn't exist. In the US, we had building code, but here the building code was defined afterwards. So who were responsible for defining that building code? Who evolved that building code? Who set the foundation for it? Of course, the folks from IGBC, the folks from GRIHA, and of course, the contribution from LEED. So what was once a leadership standard has now become the foundation for people to understand that these are minimum things that you have to do. And naturally, these leadership standards evolve on top of these guidelines and code. So there is a little bit of cyclical effect that happens where you are taking advantage of minimum requirements, which the law requires you to do, and then the things that you want developers to go beyond, right? Because particularly since it is a journey, you have to always keep raising the bar on the market, but you should raise the bar enough that people can adopt and achieve it, and in a viable cost-centric way. So this has been the journey of IGBC, GRIHA, and LEED. So they have done phenomenal work. That is the first point. Second point is that all of them tackle green requirements for a building. How do you do green design? How do you do green construction? And how do you do green operations? And they are all step towards going to net zero. But they can't claim themselves to be, unless they are actually done a net zero design and a net zero construction and a net zero operations. They cannot claim themselves to be a net zero building because they have to net their GHG emissions. They have to demonstrate that if it is energy, if it is water, if it is emissions, if it is waste, they are net zero. What it means is that they are not taking more than what they should, and they are always in balance so that nothing is out of balance, which is the zero, right? So that is where we are different. And these are foundations. All these buildings could become net zero buildings. In fact, they can become net zero buildings much more easier because they have already done 60, 70, 80% of the work depending upon each building. But what we are trying to do is we are trying to be singularly focused on defining what net zero is. Second, we are telling the people that getting started is more important than actually arriving. Third, really take an incremental approach, because if you look at existing buildings, which are 97% of a building stock, in fact, around the world, you cannot take this big bang, tops-down approach where you say that you have to raise the bar and you have to do it all. So if I had to give it in a very colloquial way, all these programs are graduate programs. Mine is an incremental education program. What it tells you is that take a course credit one by one, and then you will eventually get to a graduation, which is called net zero. So we are fundamentally different from that perspective that we are trying to do bottoms up, and they are coming tops down. Now, tops down is needed because we need leadership benchmarks. Bottoms up is needed because we need to bring everybody along. And if we don't, then even if you build the 100 best LEED zero buildings in the world, or IGBC zero buildings, or GRIHA zero buildings, that will not be enough to mitigate enough emissions that we are generating.
And building construction is one of the highest contributors towards
40% of emissions and 33% of energy consumption comes from the building sector. Okay. And given that we are going to be building so many buildings, it is better that we get ahead of it and we don't have to do double work, right? And maybe we will not get the opportunity to do the second work. So the bottom line is be proactive, get the trend going, and most importantly, start working towards it and do whatever you can. So that's our philosophy. And I think we are complementary. We are not competing, and our goal is not to compete. Our goal is to harmonize. Our goal is to raise visibility. And most importantly, our goal is to get it done. So that's the way it is. So there is no point in talking about this anymore. We have to get to zero, period.
Let's move towards the policy part. So I think in 2017, the Bureau of Energy Efficiency came up with the ECBC rules, that the Energy Conservation Building Codes. So there they defined that the large buildings need to have some portion of their energy consumption coming out from the renewable energy. So do you think these kind of policies, or any state policies, are the main driving force towards green buildings or net zero buildings, or there is something else that the clients focus, or that is deriving the focus or the motivating them to move towards green buildings or net zero buildings?
See, policy always helps. A good policy with a clear guidelines and incentives and of course ramifications always helps. Why? Because it sets a minimum floor. It helps everybody to move in a direction, get things done, and really do this for the longer term. So that otherwise we have heard excuses. We have heard excuses from everybody. Why I should do green is not real, or I will do only pieces of green. So this becomes this selective selection process doesn't help us to, particularly for a country like India, it doesn't help. For that matter, any country. It doesn't help when you start picking and choosing on what strategies you're going to deploy. So policy, an institution, an agency like ECBC and a code like that is always a must, right? And being able to actually dictate to an extent that you should start thinking about it, like renewable energy, a composition of renewable energy. That is super critical, because then people start thinking, hey, how do I do this? It starts consumption. And when demand starts, everything changes, right? You see the ecosystem come into play. People try to make it viable, easy to access. Good business leaders find opportunities. The whole ecosystem effect, network effect happens. A good policy is a must. However, the policy alone can be the reason for us to do, because the policy is always focusing on what the mass transformation can do.
Good.
But we need leadership. At this point in time, climate change needs much more leadership, right? And that is where all these voluntary rating systems, including ourselves, come into play, where we can tell the people that, okay, you have gotten this done from a regulation and a policy point of view. Now tell me, what else can you do? How does it contribute to the innovation cycle? And how is it going to build your differentiation strategy? And how is your brand going to be different to make the difference to build a responsible and a sustainable world? So that's the lens through which we are looking at it. So a policy working in tandem with voluntary standards is the way to go. And that's a model that has worked for the last 30 years. And I don't see any reason it will be any different going forward.
So at the central level, we had this ECBC. So then a lot of states also notified the state building codes. But I think in India currently there is a lack of any legislation which can enforce buildings to go for renewable energy or make them net zero. So do you think India needs any kind of legislation to make it uniform or enforce it, make it mandatory for the buildings to go for net zero buildings?
I think there are a lot of guidelines evolving. And as you really know, that even that you yourself are a very dominant leader in the renewable energy space in terms of talking about this, with the Reinvestor 2024, where we saw Modi ji make his 100 days proclamation of how this whole renewable energy segment of this country is going to change. You saw that even without legislation, you saw demand went through the rooftop, right? So it literally we went to rooftop through solar and wind and whatnot. We saw unprecedented commitments. And the level of commitments to go to our 500 gigawatt of requirement was such a gratifying thing for me to watch and witness from both the Minister of Renewable Energy and of course our Honorable Prime Minister. So I feel like while legislation is important, we ought to also recognize as a country and as the leaders of our country are signaling, we are now making this big shift that we are not just relying on legislations alone to do the good work, but definitely legislation will help. But I think he kind of made a legislation by creating a market demand and a market opportunity for players to come in and do the good work. And I think that is much more progressive and forward-looking, because it creates a gamification effort. It creates that extraordinary ownership for people to respond, so that people think that it is their duty to do it. Because, in the green building world, I always said that green building for everyone within this generation, and everyone means everyone. That means everyone must act, everyone must support, and everyone must lead. So legislation is one dimension of leadership. but we want everybody to lead. So legislation will work, but we can go beyond legislation.
How you see the best practices, some of the best successful stories from some other countries? Have you seen any other country coming with any legislation or strong guidelines to enforce or make these net zero buildings more viable, more in numbers?
Yeah, I think the leader will be always United States. United States has got strong guidelines. If you take city of New York, if you take California, if you take Boston, if you take the Washington D.C., these states have got stronger policies and legislations, to your point, and guidelines and procedures and directions and incentives. So many things they have put in to really make the real estate sector less carbon intensive. So the decarbonization journey is profound. So there are good examples. And of course, China is another example I'll quote. And third is that I will say that today India is also at par with the rest of the countries because we are shaping policy and there is a larger awareness on the ground. So I would say example-wise, United States, definitely China, Europe is also doing a lot of great work around that side. So I think there are good examples out there.
So you're a strong advocate of green buildings and net zero buildings. So how you convince your consumers or your clients? Because in terms of cost, how you can explain? Because conventionally, a building which is not zero versus a building which is net zero, how is the cost factor? How the cost increases, escalates when one is planning a net zero building or a green building?
So let's start with the green building, right? Today, for you to build a base level green building in this country, it should not cost you more.
Okay.
Unless you demand it properly. Obviously, green has always been rated as a premium. There is enough examples out there in this country. A lot of leaders have already demonstrated that you don't need to build a base level green building with a lot of cost. We can do it at cost.
So it is more about planning rather than cost.
More design. Now, however, there are also luxurious element to it, right? If you want to go to the most advanced attributes of green, then you're going to have some cost. But those costs can be justified by the organization, take those decisions. And the return on investment, if it is not 2 years, it will happen in 3 or 5 years. Because these organizations are going beyond the status quo. So they're trying to lead. So when you look at from these two perspectives, I think green being costly is a myth. And I would always tell my clients, whoever I go to, say, ask for a different quote, ask for comparison, ask and put efforts to understand why that anomaly is happening on the ground. And most importantly, really get educated on how you can do better things. And design drives everything. That is on the green building side. Net zero building, you can see people could make an argument saying, well, putting together a solar park will cost me more money because I have to switch my energy supply. It's not. You know this better than me. Solar is getting cheaper by the day. You can make it affordable. Efficiency is improving. And most importantly, there are a lot of incentives, a lot of support mechanisms, a lot of financing mechanisms available to you to deploy solar. And I've heard about enough about in wind. There is enough battery integration coming in. Hydrogen is coming soon in the future. So I think the market is working towards making it affordable, accessible, and most importantly, reliable. Because for power, we need reliability. So that's how I make the case. I tell them that, as much as you desire to get the iPhone 16 Pro, please make an effort to make your modern day building also to be current with the latest technologies. Otherwise, the cost of retrofitting 10 years, 15 years from now would be very expensive, and maybe you'll never get it done.
So explain to us, like, if I am a client, I am building a net zero building, I'm planning to build a net zero building. So my upfront cost will go up, but at return, what I am likely to get? Will I get kind of compensation?
I think at the end of the day, you are going to at least not lose your money on it. Your investment will be recouped because at the very minimum, I'm a conservative projector. I don't try to say these lofty business cases to people because I don't want people to tie their work towards sustainability so much to the business case that they do it only for the business case. It's our moral responsibility. It's a responsibility that you have to actually execute for your survival and for your children's survival. So it's a moral code. But on top of that, obviously I understand money matters, cost matters, and we have to make sure that we don't get things that we need at an exorbitant cost that we cannot afford. So the truth is, I'll be shocked if somebody could not recoup their investment. Now the question is, some people recoup this in 2 years, some people recoup this in 5 years. That is tied to their consumption, that is tied to their design, and most importantly, that is tied to how they actually really maintain, manage, and monitor their own operations, right? It's like a good car you bought. You can get the mileage you want, but you have to drive it well.
Last question, what we can learn from the village architecture, like those people who had built their villages with mud house, thatched rooftops. So what we can learn from their architecture, who are not actually architects, but they have designed their buildings in such a way that they do not feel much heat during summers and even winters they are at benefit.
Because the most interesting, when we come to India, we always have that parity, right? The village versus urban. And villages have taught us many. So first they have always started with the premise. The premise of I will not have this, so I need to do everything to compensate it, right? That's a very, very interesting way to start with a design process. So you start applying the constraint of a resource constraint. Then you start thinking about what innovations can I do. That's where all these innovations happen, be it a roof, be it a wall, be it a floor. And then there is minimalism involved, right? It is not a consumption-oriented thinking. It is more a minimalist thinking. So that is a design philosophy that we can apply in modern day design, and so many buildings have done it. Number one. Number two is integration with the nature. Because sustainability today is an afterthought. We are applying sustainability into the modern day building. After we have shifted it, we have created the lifestyle. But what we need to understand is we have to connect to the nature. We have to connect the biodiversity elements. We have to think about our air. We have to think about our sun. We have to think about our access. We have to think about our community, connection. So when you start thinking about it, that is where I think we can learn a lot for the modern architecture. So if you see one of the best modern architectures, they have reflected that village thinking. Last but not the least, it is also about starting with the most important ingredient, who is going to be part of that place. You're going to play hard, you're going to work hard, but you have to have comfort in your home, whether it is small or a big. But you need to have comfort, and you need to have joy, and you need to have happiness in your home. That is what you see in the village architecture. So I think we can infer that.
So last question is, anything you want to talk about your organization, how your organization is working towards boosting net zero buildings, green buildings?
See, thank you for that question, because that's very, very important for me to highlight. What I have seen is that we are doing so many things. So many good things are happening. But we need to get to a measurable, repeatable sequence of how we are going to get to net zero. Because this country has made a commitment to 2070 to go to net zero. But we want to be Viksit Bharat in 2047. This doesn't need to be two different dates. On the 100th year of our independence, if we can show the world that we have arrived at net zero 3 years earlier, that is the best news we can deliver to the world. And we can show that in 100 years, we came from a country that was under slavery to all the way to we have become the leader in the world. Because there is nobody right now leading on climate. No winner out there in the market. Everybody's trying to be a winner. But we can be that winner. Okay. That winner is the person who gets it done on 2047. So our pursuit is to help people try to get on that journey and get it done before 2050. So my wish for India, my commitment to India, and my work for India would be that I don't want to see 2070 because I won't be alive. But I will be alive possibly by 2047, and I want to see a net zero India by 2047, and we truly become a Viksit responsible Bharat in 2047. So that is what we are committed to, and we are doing that through certification, supporting, leadership, and most importantly, educate, implement, and celebrate.
Thank you. Thank you for talking to us.
Thank you so much.
And for sharing your valuable insights.